Very excited to have such an esteemed panel to talk about a fantastic topic. Tonight we're going to be looking at the U.S. energy revolution from the Americas to Japan. But before I hand it over to our panelists, in thinking about tonight's discussion, I went back 10 years. And that's what I want all of you to do for the next minute or so, is to contemplate what the energy landscape in the United States looked like 10 years ago. It is far from what we see today. Today, we are looking at, the conversation is U.S. energy abundance, both in terms of oil and natural gas. I mean, even going back to 2006, 2007, we were talking about scarcity. We were talking about importing LNG from Qatar, and now the conversation is about exports. As a teacher, I always like to sort of turn my students to handouts, and so each of you has a handout here. And these are just two simple pages that really kind of highlight what we are talking about. The United States is now the largest liquids and gas producer in the world. It has surpassed Russia in terms of natural gas growth. It is ahead of both Saudi Arabia and Russia in terms of crude oil. It is half of the new production is coming from unconventional resources. So it's coming from tight oil production and from shale gas. So these have had significant impacts on the market. Interesting conversations to be had around what it means for energy trade, what it means for technology, and also the growth of renewables in terms of what that means in terms of renewables being complementary to gas or now competing with gas. So I'm as I said, very excited to be here to be part of this important conversation, and just thrilled to have these three panelists here with us. So I'm going to do quick introductions. I'm not going to read their full bios because they're included in the information you have in front of you, but please do take the time to read their bios. They have fantastic backgrounds. So I have Majad Limam, who is Manager, Americas LNG and Natural Gas Consulting with Poten and Partners. Gil Porter, who is a partner with Haynes and Boone. And Salim Samaha, who's a partner with Global Infrastructure Partners. To kind of get this, to get the conversation started, I've asked each of our panelists to give a short 2 to 3 minute opening in terms of how they see the landscape and some of the things that they're looking at in terms of their day-to-day work. So I'm going to start with Majad.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kisan. Thank you to the Japan Society. It's an honor, really, to be part of this panel and discuss a subject that is very important. If you look at the last decade, as Dr. Kisan mentioned, the energy revolution out of North America had very large impacts worldwide, both from a perspective of exports out of the U.S., both on natural gas, LNG, and crude oil, but also on the geopolitical front, as far as the U.S. relying much less on imports than anticipated. So I'm part of Poten and Partners, focusing on LNG, based out of New York, but we're global. We have presence and follow the market very closely from the grounds up. And I can tell you one thing, the largest development we've seen is the emergence of the United States from a potential large importer to becoming a key exporter to the global market. So today in the United States, we have 6 large projects under construction, one in operation, 5 under construction, one in operation, and then LNG Canada has just taken FID about a month ago, so a total of 7 projects that have taken FID out of North America. This together, once they're all in operation, will be around 80 to 85 million ton per year in the global market. That is today around 290 million tons. So the US is going to be a big part of the supply picture, competing with the likes of Qatar and Australia for the pole position. So this has ramification, from the perspective of availability, the US position globally, and also the opportunities for buyers to buy LNG from the US and particularly Japan, but also from the Americas to get LNG from the United States and the repercussion that has. So happy to talk about that in more detail and any questions. I look forward to a good discussion.
Great, thank you. Gil?
Thank you as well, Japan Society, for inviting me. This is a wonderful opportunity. I'm intrigued by the comment of seeking the pole position, because part of what I'm still trying to figure out is where we're racing. I come from the perspective of a law firm that advises. I chair our projects practice, where we advise our lender clients, our investor clients, and sponsors. We also have a very large energy-focused practice on exploration and development. So we've been quite integrally involved in seeing how the energy market has careened over the last few years, both in terms of taking advantage of the enormous new production capabilities and also dealing with the resultant volatility in a lot of energy prices. It's good and bad always come together. And so we evaluate, as I like to call it, we're in the business of being professional paranoids. Please don't leave this to the amateurs. In assessing where the opportunities are, how to mitigate those risks, and how to turn plays into longer-term investment opportunities. And that's the bias I'll bring to this conversation.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. Salim?
Yeah, thank you as well for having me. Just maybe by quick background, we're a global infrastructure investor. We're primarily focused on the OECD, and energy is our biggest sector, and we're investing in the upstream, not in the upstream, but in the midstream. So anything from gathering, processing, pipelines, all the way to terminals. I'll tell you, I've been in this industry for almost 20 years, and it's really very humbling to see how things have changed over the past 10 years. You're always looking at where you are, trying to forecast where you're going to be over a 5-10 year period, and it turns out to be completely different. So we approach investing really from that perspective. We're at a very exciting time. Obviously, you all know about the growth in unconventional production, which has now really spilled over into crude oil. Will crude oil coming out of the Permian and other unconventional basins in the U.S. really have a material impact on the global market? What are the geopolitical implications of that? It's truly fascinating. The other thing we've been at the forefront of is really renewables technology and the lower cost that we see year over year in renewables technology. And that shift has happened a lot faster than what we expected. In some cases, that's been very painful. In other cases, it's been very beneficial because we're one of the largest owners of renewables globally, including a very big platform in Japan, which I think is really in the infancy of the development of its renewables platform. So it's a very exciting time. By the same token, the potential outcomes are much wider than perhaps they've ever been. And so you have to be extra vigilant about how you pursue these opportunities.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. So, Majed, I'm going to start with you. So you took us through in terms of, the 6 projects that are underway and one that is operating. Can you give us a kind of a picture of what the U.S. LNG sort of export market looks like in terms of who is the U.S. selling to and what are sort of prospects over the next 5 years in terms of shifts that you see coming to the market?
Yeah. So as we said, the U.S., if you look at the projects are in operation, under construction, could add up to around 70 million ton per year. So that is done to sold mostly long term to buyers, whether it's through contracts or capacity in Asia particularly, but also to other markets. In our view, the opportunity is still there for more developments out of the U.S. and the second wave that you hear quite a bit talked about. But this is driven by demand globally. So in our view, the buyers and the availability of quality buyers that can make these projects develop and become bankable is key and is the driver to not only how many projects you will see develop in the US, but globally. Liquefaction projects are multi-billion investments. Typically, they would come with anchoring the development on quality buyers. And this is one thing that is key to developing that chain, the strength of the chain. So the US is of course, very well positioned as far as some of the projects that can be expanded. Some of the projects that are still import terminal that could be converted to export projects and therefore have a cost advantage, you could say. But the competition is intense globally. So the US and these projects are developing and trying to secure buyers with, and in competition with the likes of Mozambique, Qatar, additional Russian projects, expansions in places like Papua New Guinea. And to us, it's very important to always then put ourselves in the shoes of the buyers and see which preference they have, and they cannot look at them monolithically. Each buyer is very different, and find a good match with the project, which has been a challenge because there's so much choice to these buyers. But the opportunities are there. In our view, you will see more projects coming out of the US, expansions from the existing projects or the one under construction, and potentially Canada, beyond LNG Canada. But it's a very competitive area.
So, Gil and Salim, what do you see as some of the sort of the finance and the infrastructure challenges of U.S. LNG moving forward?
You want to start? Or?
Well, why don't I start and then you can correct me.
All right.
The core element of financing these projects is, as Majid has already mentioned, which is that to date they've either been done on a tolling basis, where you simply pay a fee for processing the gas, but a firm contract, or else it's been based on firm price contracts to take this off. But the bottom line is the sale of the product is assured and the revenue is assured, and there's not a market risk component built into the project. And that's made it relatively attractive for lenders to come in because it's a classic project finance scheme. Operational risk only, not market risk, with technology that's well known. As we move forward, it's going to be a little more questionable whether we're going to see the same kind of offtake, whether it's going to be at a lower level of total production instead of being able to contract away 80+%. Maybe it'll be a smaller percentage with a certain amount of risk. It's going to be less clear who the buyers are, whether they'll introduce some market risk to it. And that's really going to be based on the demand levels and whether or not it can be contracted. I've heard some speculation that we're going to see a lot less end users and a lot more market makers who are going to be taking this position and who will be taking sponsorship roles. But we also see some projects being developed by what I'd call, for want of a better term, venture capital companies. New management teams funded independently without major market connections. And we're going to see how that all shapes up. We will see more market risk in the projects, though, and that's going to be the adaptation for the lenders.
Great, thank you.
Look, from my perspective, I mean, these are really big projects. They require a lot of capital. So a big part of the cost is what's your cost of capital. That has to include debt, and if it's going to include debt, you're going to need long-term contracts. So I don't think long-term contracts are dead, and I think if you look at what's happened recently, on a number of projects. We've seen a lot of these long-term contracts. The question is, who are they going to be with? We own an interest in Freeport Train 4. We have a binding HOA with Sumitomo, who is, clearly sees value in U.S. LNG and monetizing this cheap resource that we have, and they're putting their balance sheet behind us, behind the project. At the end of the day, you have growth in China, growth in India. There are very few companies in these countries where the banks, at least in the U.S. and Europe, will finance. That's just the reality. So the people who step into those shoes are going to be the big traders, the big oil companies, and because they're taking that credit risk either with these companies or with the smaller amount of emerging markets demand, whether it's Pakistan or Bangladesh, and they're sleeving that, they're going to want to get paid for that risk. So to be successful in this business, you really have to be able to manage your costs very effectively. Now, we happen to have a lot of brownfield expansions in the U.S., which are very cost competitive on a global stage, as Majid pointed out, is pretty competitive. But what's also been clear to me, particularly over the past 12 months, and how quickly this LNG market's turned around, is the location of the LNG project matters. Do you have optionality across different basins? You have that in the U.S. I don't think you have that in international projects. What about the geopolitical risk? I know the U.S. isn't perfect, but we still have rule of law. We've got there are a lot of benefits and stability to sourcing your gas out of the U.S. And then I think most people will take the view that Henry Hub prices are going to remain low and not that volatile in the grand scheme of things, whereas Brent pricing will tend to be much more volatile. So for those and other reasons, we're seeing a lot of buyers come to the U.S. Whether that's going to create another glut because they're taking market share away from somewhere else, and maybe there isn't as much demand growth as people think. I think only time will tell. And I just try to remember that 12 months ago, everybody thought we were going to have a glut until 2025. But 1 year later, it seems to be quite the opposite. So that's very, very humbling.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, when you look out at what we've seen in the LNG space, and since you mentioned, the crude oil space, in terms of we've just seen a 25% reduction in the price of oil, but we've seen an uptick in natural gas prices recently. So it's oftentimes very hard to sort of predict where things are going to go. Yeah. In terms of optionality, Majid, what about the Panama Canal? I mean, is in terms of, will there be challenges moving forward in terms of moving this extra supply out?
So the Panama Canal, of course, allows for savings. If you're a U.S. Gulf project targeting Asia, particularly Japan and Korea, that basically shaves $1 per million BTU out of your cost of shipping the LNG, which is obviously can improve the economics delivered to Japan quite a bit. So the Panama Canal has actually self-imposed some limitations, some of them temporary, of how many ships can go through, how many LNG ships can go through. But as they gain experience with the new canal, that has been lessened. And what we see is, at least from the latest release from the Panama Canal Authority, that LNG will have, at the end of the day, eventually more than one slot a day. Actually, that is happening now with loosening of the nighttime limitation of transit for LNG, and also the crossing of LNG ships that also could be loosened more. Potentially, you could have two LNG dedicated slots, or one dedicated and one competitive slot for LNG, which could release quite a bit of capacity. So you hear a lot of that a lot of the US LNG will go to Asia, which is correct, but it's important to note there are other markets that could take it. For example, South America, Europe. So if you assume about 60% goes to Asia, not all of it will go through the Panama Canal, because if you're actually targeting the Middle East, east of Suez, or India, or Pakistan, or Bangladesh, or even parts of China, southern China, the other routes are as competitive or more competitive than the Panama Canal. So the Panama Canal comes for demand that is mainly Japan, Korea, northern China, very important demand centers, but by no means the only Asia-Pacific growth markets. So we've developed that envelope to see where the Panama Canal is critical. And if you do that math, then you'll see that if it's one slot per day, there could be issues. If it's increased and given the flexibility to go more than one, potentially it may be okay over a yearly average period. It's important to note that LNG is quite seasonal. So there will be peaks during Northern Hemisphere winter, for example, where the call on Asian demand is higher, and on US Gulf to go to Asia is higher. And you could have perhaps some periods where it gets busier. But with the improvement that the Panama Canal is going through and getting kind of lessons learned on the operational side, hopefully that will not be as big a bottleneck in the future.
Great, thank you. So moving into thinking about U.S. energy trade with Canada and Mexico. Gil, can you sort of just share in terms of where you see, in terms of new developments? Majed in his introduction mentioned LNG Canada, in terms of will we see some competition coming from Canada? Will we see sort of more opportunities? There's clearly lots of interesting trade that happens currently.
Sure. Well, I'll start with one of the big questions, which is, of course, we now have the USMCA, or some people call it NAFTA 2.0. And one of the big questions is, how does it address energy? And the short answer is, it doesn't really get into the energy markets at all. It maintains certain dispute mechanisms and open trade mechanisms, but there's no real energy section per se in it. And in that sense, it continues just as its predecessor did. So we're really looking at market forces that are unchanged. Clearly, there are Canadian LNG projects in development. I'd say from my perspective, the most intriguing, though, have been ones that interconnect with the U.S. gas system and thus maintain a diversity of supply. But we do expect some. There are logistical claims by those as to them being better located than the Gulf Coast. You can avoid the Panama Canal, for instance. But we have to see how they're going to develop. I don't know that there's a clear answer to me, at least right now. Perhaps you have a clearer sense of that.
Well, there's clearly a very cheap gas resource in Canada. There's clearly a locational advantage to going to Asia because you're on the West Coast. The problem is, how much is it going to cost to build these LNG facilities in that type of climate with a much smaller workforce? What's the potential for delay and overruns? And then two, the pipelines that you have to build to feed these facilities are also very expensive. They go through some pretty tough terrain. They got to go through First Nations issues. I know on some of these pipelines, the pipeline companies have had to sign over 150 mutual benefits agreements with different First Nations. So it's a pretty complicated environment. I don't think you can really realistically build more than one at a time and feel really good about your risk. So long term, Canada has a tremendous amount of potential, but I think the build out is going to be measured for all of these reasons.
Great, thank you. So maybe while we're on North America, I would love to get from the three of you your sort of take on some of the risks that you see or that you associate with the Trump administration and energy policy under the Trump administration. If you see, looking out over the next 2 years, potentially longer, risks to U.S. oil, gas, renewables.
It's the risk of the unknown, obviously. Tariffs on solar panels change the equation, though probably not to a point where it creates real jeopardy in the renewables industry. Back in June, I was presenting to an audience about the petrochemicals market, and we were wondering, because China represents over 50% of the projected growth in that export market for the U.S., and the obvious question was, how would tariffs influence that? And I once again proved that you should never, ever ask me to forecast U.S. trade policy, because I speculated that I didn't think it likely that China would put tariffs on those products because they were core to the the value chain from which they generate a lot of their products. Dismissing any number of other arguments, it took only about a week and a half for me to be proved wrong on that. I think the real problem with a trade war is that it is unpredictable.
Any other thoughts? Majed, Salim?
Well, we'll see what happens longer term, of course. I mean, on the gas front, on the LNG front, I mean, a lot of talk about China. Now, it is true that China, if you look at where, again, we started, I think we all agree how important markets are to projects developing in the future. And if you look at the LNG end of it, really Asia is the key growth, and leading that is China, at least from a projection perspective. And a lot of the buyers in China are indeed looking for LNG for longer term use. So the relationship between the US and China and tariffs on US LNG, if it's sustained longer term, will put the US at an economic, I mean, I wouldn't say disadvantage, meaning they're not competitive. They can still be competitive despite the tariff, but less so than you were before. And that's one issue. And then how the Chinese government reacts as far as Chinese buyers going in aggressively and seeking U.S. presence in U.S. and lifting LNG from the U.S. is also very important, because that, again, is a key to making projects develop, is getting those buyers in. So we'll see. I mean, longer term things will perhaps adjust, but that's one thing we keep an eye on, is the Chinese demand and how the U.S. could and how far can it penetrate it.
I would just add that, look, it's a global commodity. It gets traded globally. So individually, you know, U.S. LNG costs a little bit more in China, so it's going to go somewhere else. There's some friction and inefficiency in how you move cargoes around, but it's really not the end of the world. What worries me more about a trade war is, what does that do to economic confidence more broadly? Things can really spiral out of control, and then that could cause all sorts of demand destruction, on a global scale. So that's really the primary risk of what's going on in terms of trade policy today.
Great. So one thing that is really interesting in terms of when you look at the impact of the, let's say, natural gas revolution here in the United States, is that we've seen some pretty dramatic shifts in the power sector in terms of today, I think we're at 34% of electricity generation comes from gas. So we've seen a tremendous displacement away from coal. Looking out and sort of looking at the demand picture in countries like China and India, which have, they have significant targets in terms of for reducing carbon emissions, but also increasing the amount of gas. How do you see the markets sort of meeting that demand, and also sort of thinking about the role of renewables in terms of, is there a risk associated with countries sort of choosing to sort of skip, to not transition from coal to gas to renewables, but to sort of leapfrog and go straight to renewables? I'm just sort of curious your thoughts on that.
Well, we're a big believer and investor in renewables. You know, in the U.S., we own a company called Clearway Energy, which has about 6,000 megawatts, and they're operational and a much bigger development portfolio. The U.S. is a pretty interesting market because you know, you've got almost no demand growth. You have very little demand growth. You've got coal retirements. Gas is filling some of that, but so is renewables. But you also have a lot of corporates that want to look more green. You have states that are imposing renewables portfolio standards. So renewables continue to take a bigger and bigger share of a market that's not really growing. And that creates some overcapacity. But if you're the renewables owner, you're getting 15, 20-year take-or-pay contract where you're getting your capital back and some pretty good return in that time frame. It puts fossil generation in a very difficult position unless you're absolutely in the right spots. The other thing I would observe is the grids have been able to integrate batteries to a much greater degree than people you know, have really understood historically. And they've done that even without battery technology. And now with battery technology getting much cheaper, and I really believe it's going to get to 100 kW in the next 4 or 5 years, and probably even cheaper than that, and you integrate that with renewables, it's going to be extremely competitive. And we're going to start implementing some coupling some battery technology with our renewables when we provide a service offering to end users, and we're going to do that in the U.S. but also on a global scale.
Yeah, I think there are a couple answers depending on what country we deal with. In the U.S., I think the renewables market is clearly substantially unaffected by the price of gas. There's a separate mission. It's not a federal energy policy, it's state, really, that's pushing it, and it's not changing based on price and availability of gas. It's not changing based on the possibility of coal becoming a fuel again. It's here, it's evolving, and the technologies are mature with ever-reducing prices to a point where the irony is, in the old days, you would have to subsidize renewables to make them cost-effective. Now you probably have to start worrying about subsidizing coal to make it cost-effective. So in the U.S., it's not much of a question. It's just an evolutionary process at this point. As we go overseas, we see a lot of demand for renewables almost everywhere. It's a huge market right now throughout Central America and Latin America, the Caribbean. Renewables provide a couple of nice elements that you don't get from other technologies. You can decentralize your power demands. You can situate them remotely. You don't need the same extensive transmission grid necessarily. You can do it in smaller bits, price points that work better. The concept of jumping, though, from, say, coal to renewables poses the physical problem that renewables are simply smaller scale technologies. And you can't shut down a coal plant and expect to replace it with renewables in the next year. It isn't going to happen. And so there's a transition point. But you can look at Latin America. Cost of gas there is not really very attractive since it's going to be LNG. And so what we see is renewables moving much more quickly there, oftentimes by industrial demand and not so much just by government, and sometimes by a cross-section. Mexico, for instance, has a mandate that over the next 7 years, all major industrials must be 25% based on renewables, and they're largely finding their own way to it. So it's a mixed message, but I don't subscribe to the theory that renewables are endangered. They aren't.
Great, thank you. Anything you'd like to add?
Agreed, and I agree. It's country specific. I mean, every country has availability of local production of feed energy. For example, in India and China, very large coal reserves. Obviously, for power generation, if you look for an economic solution, coal is typically it. You look in the United States with availability of gas, and following the shale gas revolution, depends on feed gas price and price of gas in the United States and coal and so on. But gas can be competitive to small Caribbean island nations where they're burning petroleum products to generate electricity. And LNG could come in economically and compete with petroleum products for power. But then there may be mandates for renewables, and how would that work together and complement each other are areas we look at constantly. But it's so different from one area to the other. I agree. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Well, we're here at the Japan Society, and I think we should sort of set our sort of attention now on Japan in terms of what we see happening in the Japan energy sector. After the Fukushima disaster in 2011, Japan very much benefited from the abundance of LNG that was available. And now Japan is starting to bring some of its more nuclear online. I think as of now we have 9 nuclear power plants which are back online. How do you see that impacting and influencing the energy market in Japan? Or what do you see it doing in terms of its LNG trade?
So, I mean, one interesting, actually, and the history that you mentioned, Dr. Kissan, is that we'll talk about impact of North America and the shale gas revolution worldwide, but on Japan. I mean, one reason Japan was able to procure more than 12 to 15 million tons per year of LNG to replace the lost nuclear generation capacity was in a way indirectly linked to the shale gas revolution, because a lot of the LNG that was destined to go to the United States from Qatar, but elsewhere, West Africa, Middle East, North Africa, to the United States, was able to divert, given that it's not as needed in the United States anymore, and find a home in Japan. To that level, I mean, the market was able to sustain a couple million tons, but up to 15 million tons of diversions was that flexibility that the US brought into the market by not taking those volume it had actually committed or signed on to originally. So that has provided the flexibility needed, and that was critical for Japan to replace some of its nuclear lost capacity. So as the capacity comes back, those 10 million ton, maybe less, could go somewhere else. And here I would agree, we're in a global market now that today is more than 310 million ton per year. So that and increased flexibility as far as demand centers and supply sources. So perhaps some of the Japanese buyers would have to do some diversions, and again, it could be very seasonal during certain months of the year where demand is not as high, and they are getting the type of commitments, particularly from the US, that offers that type of flexibility for diversions. So they face uncertainties. They're trying to build almost mini aggregator trading type positions to buffer for those uncertainties as they go forward. And in that respect, the supply projects that can offer flexibility and diversion flexibility typically would be considered an advantage because of the unknown quantities that some of the, not just in Japan, but in Asia, deal with. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And do anything, Salim or Gil, that you'd like to add?
Look, Japan is not a growing market for energy. So anytime you're going to bring in new supply, that's going to decline. I think the question is, renewables. Right now you have a good feed-in tariff to really kickstart renewables in Japan. We've been a big player in that. There are a lot of golf courses that are underutilized, so we put a lot of solar panels on those golf courses, and it's been a very effective way to really increase renewables penetration. But at the end of the day, this is how it all starts, and then the renewables industry in a country that starts with a feed-in tariff gets more and more efficient over time. The question is, how efficient can we get, and how much demand can we take away from, nuclear or other sources that people may not like as much in the long-term scheme of things.
So one question that it's always when we talk about the U.S. energy revolution that comes up is the story of technology, right? In terms of how technology has played such a significant role in the increased production that we've seen. So where do you see sort of the technology going? Where do you see in terms of, are we close to hitting a sort of a plateau in terms of how much we're going to sort of grow gas in the United States as well as, our crude oil production? How do you, Gail, I know I don't want to put anyone on the spot to sort of give their sort of forecast for a bit in terms of when you're sort of thinking about what's on the horizon.
Well, I'll cover that in two pieces if I can. In terms of productivity of fossil fuels, if there's one thing that's been the most amazing in the last 10 years is that every time we think we've hit a plateau,
Right, exactly.
efficiency and cost of production change by logarithmic factors overnight. It's incredibly efficient. At this point, the cost of producing oil in a large number of the fields is cost effective if oil was down in the $30 range. And that's unheard of. And I hear some stories that it's lower than that now. I don't see us discovering that we're out of gas or out of oil or that we're in production decline anytime in our near future. And if anything, I think we're going to see that the technology will continue to improve, with some questions, obviously, in terms of regulatory oversight at some point, because there are questions that need to be looked at and need to be evaluated. At the same time, we've seen over the last, 8 years easily, a number of new technology innovations attempted from a lot of emerging companies. And they continue to suffer from what the Department of Energy used to refer to as the valley of death, which is that basic problem that you can develop a pilot plant with really interesting technologies, particularly, to my mind, the alternative fuels technologies, but also in the biomass space, where it's been very much of a hit or miss technology area, but with tremendous opportunity if we find the right scalable technologies. There are lots of interesting technologies that are coming up, but they're really not able to get to a commercial scale. And that's simply because the vast amount of money that's necessary to bring it to commercial scale simply doesn't fit neatly into any of our capital schemes right now. So I'd say there's a lot of promise there, but I'm not really sure how we're going to cross that valley. For a brief period, we were looking at Department of Energy funded programs, but even that was not a very well-focused program, because when you start a program saying, I want new technology, but I don't want to lose a dime, you're really not providing much guidance in terms of parameters. Personally, I'd like to see a lot more support by this government on those technologies, because I think they have promise, but that's a politically fraught question.
Anything, Celine?
There's a lot to keep track of on technology, and unfortunately, I'm not an engineer to really follow it in that detail. But I'll give you a few examples. One, solar panels. They may be able to use capture different rays of light in order to become even more efficient than they are today. The cost of production on these is constantly coming down. That could be a real global game changer. Wind turbines are becoming more modular to better be suited to different sites. You're having bigger and bigger blades. You're having artificial intelligence being used to reposition a wind farm as a whole rather than an individual unit, so you can squeeze out additional efficiency that's really driving the cost structure lower. You've got electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles. How does that play out? How does consumer behavior really respond to that? Do people want to drive more because they don't have to do it themselves, or do millennials really go to this shared services model rather than owning cars? So you get into the shale technology, and then you've got artificial intelligence really analyzing how much fluid you need to use to frack a well, how many stages, the intervals, going through a lot of data that we can't absorb as human beings to figure out how to drive the cost structure lower. At the end of the day, technology will continue to surprise us on the upside because we're only recovering a small portion of these hydrocarbons. So the way I think about it is we're going to be demand constrained on the natural gas side in the U.S., and the real savior for gas prices is going to be LNG. And as Majid pointed out, it's a very competitive global market. So how much LNG are we really going to export? The other thing on the oil side is you've got tremendous amount of production. The technology keeps getting better. Is it going to, in the face of potentially declining demand because of EV penetration, does the U.S. really change the long-term pricing of crude oil globally? That's something to keep track of. I think to gear away from those technologies, one of the most interesting things to me is something that Exxon's been working on for a long time, which is, we all talk about EVs and we're talking about transportation demand, but those are lighter density energy applications. If you could, use algae to get some biofuels that you can use to replace diesel, get into some petchem plants and replace naphtha. That could be very interesting. Today they can't do it without killing the algae and having to replant them, but at some point that's going to become a viable technology, and that would be a eureka moment. That's a complete game changer.
And Majid, there's been some extraordinary developments on the LNG space, right? In terms of that,
LNG, yes, is an established technology on the liquefaction side. On the import terminal, on the regas, has really been done, structurally the same way. The floating and regas, the FSRUs is relatively new development, but for the last 10 years it's now a proven technology. But has allowed savings in cost, in schedule potentially, depending on the location and port availability and so on. And that has actually, on smaller markets, has been key to develop them and allow for a quicker access to LNG, even though that is a challenge to develop if it requires infrastructure. An FSRU can provide you storage and regas, but it needs to be in a port. The meteorological conditions have to be right, the wind wave situation, and all that can make for an expensive project, but also on the regulatory side or the country's side, take time to develop. So that's been an issue with niche markets. On the technology side, and Salim mentioned this earlier, different subject is battery technology and storage. If you're in the gas business, that's going to be in your mind, because we work with countries who are developing gas and CCGTs powered by LNG or pipeline gas. And the key is making it work with renewables when of course, the sun doesn't shine, the wind doesn't blow, you've got gas to balance the load. And gas has played that role with the CCGT technology. But if batteries are advanced enough where that role is diminished, that could be a hit for gas and LNG, of course. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So, Gil, I just wanted to move to the sort of the finance side and maybe some of the economic obstacles. We hear a lot about sort of the debt that these energy companies have. Do you see, looking out, that these potentially will sort of straddle some of the expected development?
Well, I think we have to recognize that when projects go to look at their capital structure, the number one question is, how much debt can I add and how low can I get that cost? Because that's one of the biggest drivers on the cost of your product at the end of the day is your sunk capital cost in that respect. That's what your most secure senior lenders are looking for is, of course, as riskless a scenario as possible. That's why they price it that way. And that has worked well for one model we've seen, which is fully contracted offtake that's totally hedged with the supply. So whether you're doing it, as we discussed before, in a tolling arrangement where you're simply ambivalent about the input-output costs, or whether you're doing it in a situation where your offtake matches your intake, is hedged the same way. That's the model we've worked with. There is another model, but lenders are less willing to focus on it unless they have to. And I think we're going to see more and more movement towards models that have a little more merchant flavor to it. We saw that in the power industry here in the U.S. with frankly with mixed success, because once you start taking on risk, you need to know how much to take. But the question of whether or not you need to have a fully contracted project or a 60% or a 70% contracted project, the question of what kinds of market risks you can take, because let's be honest, every project has market risk. We just choose to ignore some of them. That's, I think, going to be one of the big questions in the next 10 years, is looking at how to position themselves. And a lot of lenders are trying to figure out where is their expertise going to help them take a position, because even your most conservative lenders are trying to figure out where they can get a little bit more yield for risk they can evaluate. And that's probably one of the bigger questions we are dealing with a number of our lenders. Do they want to go to, everyone wants a project with hair, is the way I describe it, so long as the hair is something that we know how to comb and cut and take care of. That's where we're going to see a lot of the movement, and I think it will open up some greater flexibility on some of the projects we're looking at.
Great.
Especially in the petrochemical space, that's going to be a driver.
Yeah, can you speak a little bit, or can any of you speak a little bit more about the petrochemical space? Because that's, again, in terms of the outlook for the United States, that's a big growth area.
Well, as has been mentioned, one of the big, it's a demand-driven economy right now for gas, and and LNG can only speak for so much. There's huge growth in the United States in the petrochemical space, and I'm not speaking scientifically. When people talk about the petrochemical space, they include things like ammonia that isn't a petrochemical. It just uses a lot of energy in order to make it. And they speak of ethane, which isn't a petrochemical. It's actually, a liquid. But ultimately, whether it's methanol, ammonia, ethane, ethylene, polyethylene, what has happened is that a lot of the players have decided to move up the value chain a little bit and say, instead of exporting gas to an industrial operation in India, China, elsewhere, who will then convert it into the next stage for a consumer product, say, we should instead be building we should instead be converting the gas here in the U.S. and exporting the higher value commodity. Also, eliminating imports, because most of these have historically been heavy import commodities, and now virtually all are at a break point as to whether import or exporting. The level of these projects is astonishing. There's an estimate of $185 billion on 300 projects that are currently scheduled out there, with a number that have come online. Not all will make it. They're constrained by logistics. There are only so many places where you can build a large export plant. And frankly, logistics in the sense of just pure manpower, finding skilled labor that can do all these projects. But this is a major area that has been largely funded by sponsors from their petty cash, do I want to say, for for a $10 billion project. We've got some big players who can afford to pay for it, but they're increasingly doing it as joint ventures. And as anyone can tell you who's been involved in joint ventures, once you step into the joint venture world, you sort of don't want to be funding it out of your own pocket. And it's going to move pretty quickly into the lender community. Problems there are that by and large, most players believe they have proprietary technology, so that's going to call into question how you do the EPC contracting. And these are not commodities that sell for long term by any natural market. So these are going to be challenges with extremely well-heeled customers, but you're going to be breaking a couple of project finance rules along the way. My view is that we always break project finance rules. We just have to be thoughtful about which ones and how many.
Great, thank you. Salim, infrastructure, I know that's a big area for you. Where do you see in terms of just globally some of the opportunities and some of the sort of challenges for U.S. oil and gas, more so LNG, in terms of where there will be sort of infrastructure constraints?
You know, what's interesting is I'm going to overlay the capital markets element here. When you look at the energy infrastructure space in the U.S. right now, with particularly in the public market, everybody's way down. There's a real lack of access to capital, and yet we need to build, depending on who you talk to, 25, 30, 40 billion a year of energy infrastructure to debottleneck all these basins and enable exports, and I'm not even including LNG in that. That hasn't stopped the infrastructure from getting built because there's a fair bit of private capital, including ourselves, that has really stepped in to fill that void. So the markets are working. The places that need debottlenecking, you know, everybody's talked about the Permian. You know, that's a debottlenecking process that's ongoing across crude, natural gas liquids. You know, you're going to have export terminals at places like Corpus Christi because you've got congestion in places like Houston. So you're going to be looking at different locations for export, and that requires some capital. And then, of course, the big ones are really all the LNG terminals because they cost a lot more than the liquids terminals. You know, renewables will also continue to be, we think, a big growth area. Now, when you go globally, renewables get even more exciting in Asia because you're competing against $10, $12 LNG, which you're not doing in the U.S. And then you've got environmental considerations that are very, very important in many places like China. So that's an area where we have big operations and a big focus. And then parts of South America, including, you know, Mexico in particular, you know, has a fair bit of work to do in terms of making sure commodities move very, very efficiently, particularly now on the liquid side and, you know, to a lesser extent the gas side, because people are really working to resolve that question.
Great. So this has been a big week, right? We started the week off with the news from the G20, and Gil sort of took us a little bit through the USMCA, whether you want to call it sort of post-NAFTA or pre-NAFTA. And tomorrow the OPEC meetings start in Vienna. So just maybe before we sort of open it up to questions, any thoughts in terms of what you think may happen, what it may mean for the United States in terms of the U.S. role, in terms of the driving sort of the OPEC decision to cut production or not, or how, and also how you see in terms of the oil price affecting the LNG market because of the connection to price. Anyone?
Well, what OPEC does and the impact, I mean, this is a very important subject, and also what Russia does as well. But overall, I mean, for one key determinant, I guess, on how well or how many LNG projects and infrastructure projects in general develop on the energy sector is the price of oil. Now, the U.S. one advantage actually brought to the LNG world is that LNG is whether you buy capacity at an export project and procure your own gas, or buy LNG through a long-term SPA, you're not exposed to oil directly because you're buying off of a Henry Hub formula. And that was a good thing when oil was very high and actually driven the development of many of these projects. When oil was 100, Henry Hub was $2.50, $3. It's much more economic to procure out of the U.S. So oil price have a huge impact as far as the attitude of Asian buyers and their interest in LNG. Of course, in a sustainable way, if oil is high, you would see much more interest in the U.S. If when oil tanks, quite a bit of focus turns a little bit away from at least the immediate focus on some of the U.S. projects. But oil has been quite, of course, difficult to predict. Anybody's projection will only prove to be wrong. So I won't venture to share that with you today. But it is very important parameter and metric that many players look at and the economics of the projects.
Great. Gil or Salim, anything you'd like to add?
One of my partners has a wonderful slide which shows the correlation of the quality of rock and roll from the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame with oil prices over the last 30 years. So predicting oil prices can be very, very challenging. I always go back that oil prices are influenced by a number of factors, some of which he's mentioned, but another one is the economy. And demand for energy products is directly linked to the GDP, which happen to be my initials, but they don't help me predict this anymore. I remain concerned as to how everything is developing and the predictions of recessions and how that's going to impact. But this is something that, alas, we're going to have to wait and see.
Yeah, I'm definitely not gonna predict the oil price. You know, it's good enough to figure out a range that makes sense where we can make good investments. But I think what's, you know, when you look at the short-term price, it's kind of interesting. If you got an extra million barrels on the market today, the market's going to be very punitive in terms of price to make sure those million barrels leave. And this is a 100 million barrel a day market, so you gotta kind of stay away from these short-term swings and really focus on the long-term fundamentals and really think about your business that way. The nice thing if you're a producer in the US is you've got all these short cycle projects, so you can move your capital around very efficiently. But if you're doing big deep water projects, you know, you're making a much longer term bet, and I think that's why you're seeing the major oil companies moving into shorter cycle projects. I think you're going to see an increase in that over time.
So I'm going to put our panelists on the spot for the last question, and then we're going to open it up. We started looking back 10 years in terms of what we've seen and what has sort of driven this U.S. energy revolution. So now I'd like to ask you to look forward. So what are some of the things that you see in terms of over the next 10 years, maybe disruptions, things that, again, I'm not asking you to sort of give the definitive forecast, but just in terms of, you know, thinking 10 years out. They all want to jump to answer this one.
I just don't want to get in his way. I can tell he's yearning to hit this up. I think electric vehicles, as much as we focus on power plants, that's about 30% of our energy consumption. The biggest driver in our energy consumption is transportation. And when you add in the ability to automate transportation, which has its own beneficial effects as well, I think that's going to have some significant transformation. I don't know how to look at it more thoughtfully than that.
That's great. Salim?
Yeah, I do believe electric vehicles are going to increase penetration faster than most people think. But you know, even if you take a very aggressive forecast of that could be 6 to 10 million barrels a day by 2030. Because if you think like the 1% and you're turning over your your fleet, every year because you can afford a new $35,000, $40,000 car. That can happen very quickly, but if you look at most people, they're not going to be able to do that. So that's just how the math really works out. It's going to be driven as much, I think, by cities as it is about the price or how cool these cars are. They're going to make it put a lot of incentives for people to have electric vehicles, and I wouldn't underestimate the power of cities rather than countries to really drive that change. Ultimately, on the transportation side, you really need to replace diesel and the higher density applications in order to really make a dent, and that's a big part of climate change. The other thing I think that people don't talk about a lot is really plastics use. That's really where the growth is in the oil market, and there's a backlash against plastics. How is this new generation really going to behave from that perspective? Are we going to come up with better recycling technologies? And if somebody went in that direction, I think that could be a real shock to probably the biggest shock to the global oil market than what we're seeing in transportation.
There are many things that keep me up at night and thinking about all this, but I think the environment and the decisions that our leaders and politicians will make in relation to a better environment and emissions, because that will reverberate all energy sectors and particularly power, but also transportation, as mentioned in the panel. And if you look at coal consumption, it hasn't gone away. In many places, it's been in the increase. From economic perspective, it may make sense, but from an environmental perspective, it doesn't. And how that decision and how those regulations, if these are regulations, are put in place and how aggressively they're actually implemented is key to understanding future growth, whether it's gas, renewables, or others. Yeah.
Great. Well, three very thoughtful responses. So now we'd like to open it up to you. I hope that you all have some questions. There's a microphone that's going around. Please identify yourself in firsthand. Thank you.
George Sheldon, I'm an architect. In regard to Japan and renewables, is it institutional factors such as the structure of the power generation industry that's held back the development of renewables, or is it geographical and climate factors?
I think it's been more of the former than the latter. It's really more about cost, and then you're comparing it to nuclear facilities. There's a big sunk cost, and with a certain cost structure that's associated with it. But increasingly, people see what the risk is around nuclear. The cost structure is starting to come down as Japan builds its supply chain around renewables, and as the renewables get cheaper, even with a suboptimal solar resource, you're going to be able to compete more effectively. And then this is even setting aside all the climate goals that different countries have set.
Do you have some more questions? Yes.
Gabriel F. Gerinos, Energy Mentors, and previously Potent Partners. I'd like the panel to discuss, in addition to the new technologies that you talked about, which I think are paramount, such as electric vehicles, which may take some transition time to become significant, perhaps as much as 10 years or more. You touched on battery technology, and I think I'd like to hear your comments as to the next generation of batteries, and I'm talking non-lithium now, especially since they're probably going to be utility scale batteries and therefore a big impact on power generation. And combine that with the fact that in many countries where we have oil and gas production, like in the Middle East, like in Africa, we also have a lot of sun. And many projects already are going in place now that are co-locations of power generation. And I think Majid mentioned that, where you have natural gas turbines for the night while you're having solar, not solar panel necessarily, perhaps concentrated solar power. If more of these projects happen in the Middle East and in Africa, you'll have even more oil, domestic oil from those countries that was used up to now for power generation that's going to be available for export. So the question is, when you're looking out 5 to 10 years, and we all know that there is a, call it oversupply of LNG, perhaps looking for more markets, what happens if you have more oil, and as you're doing more fracking in the United States, along with the oil you have more gas, and therefore you increase the gas supply. So what are your concerns, or what keeps you up at night in terms of how to keep more markets to the oil and gas business while the renewables are coming on stream?
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I agree. And this is when I shared with you some of our kind of growth areas for LNG and imports of gas, even through pipeline. These typically developing countries, such as China and India, some emerging ones in Southeast Asia, and of course, yeah, I mean, technology improvement on alternative fuels would be a direct threat to further LNG or natural gas consumption. However, in our view, that will take time. As far as not the implementation of renewables and them being cost effective, but as far as having the backup generation and the storage capability to displace the need for other alternatives and other sources of power that will balance the requirement. In our view, that is still not there technology-wise. But if that does happen, it happens at a very large scale. That is one of the areas that would definitely make a big dent on gas, in my view. Yeah.
Look, I think that's all right. From an investment perspective, I think it's more important than ever to be on the left-hand side of the cost curve, because you're going to be a lot more resilient to changes. We can all try to predict the extent of the change, and nobody's really going to know. So that's really the way you want to do it. You want to make sure that whatever you're doing works in a range of alternatives, a range of scenarios. And you really have to think about what the terminal value around these fossil generation assets really is, given all of these technological trends. But also from an ESG perspective, 5 years ago, if we were looking to invest in a coal plant, we'd probably have 50 buyers ready to buy a coal plant when we'd want to sell it. Today, it would be a very short list. Is the same thing eventually going to happen to fossil fuel assets? Only time will tell, but it's something you got to think about.
I saw there was a hand right here. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Alan Herbst. I'm with Utilis Advisory Group, and I have a question for Majid or anyone else who wants to take a shot at it. In your comments, you mentioned the second wave of U.S. LNG export projects. In your opinion, do you think that LNG exports to Europe are viable from these projects using Henry Hub pricing, or will another sort of pricing index like LNG basis Houston be required to sort of have the exports work into Europe, competing against Russian pipeline gas?
So Europe is a very diverse market for gas. If you're in Northwest Europe, if you're in the UK, Belgium, the Netherlands, there's the gas market. There's gas-on-gas competition. If you're selling gas, there's a market clearing price, whether it's LNG or otherwise, you have to sell that. So if you're a US project targeting Northwest Europe, UK, for example, your price at which you sell the LNG is going to be NBP, pretty much. Elsewhere in Europe, we're not there yet. So if you're selling into Spain, you're selling into Italy, Turkey, Greece, France, the picture is a bit more murky. You may have a mix between hub-type pricing and still oil-linked type formulas, or you could have a pure petroleum-linked formula if you're, for example, in Turkey. So Europe is by no, so you have to look at them very differently. If you're a US project that's already under construction or in operation, Europe does present very good opportunities to you, because if there's no other alternative markets, there's a market almost of last resort if you can get the capacity and sell into the market. That put almost a floor for LNG prices globally. And you've got enough sunk cost that your variable cost will be sustained by that, probably by the NBP price, unless it drops to a level that is much, much below than what we're seeing now, we're anticipating. But for new projects, that the economics is all different, because you have to look at the full life cycle of the project. You have to, do your economics based on procuring the gas, liquefying it, shipping it, and selling it at a margin to where European prices are. And where you see today is that it's a little bit more difficult proposition, just because NBP is not high enough to sustain that whole, the whole life cycle cost of the project. So we see US projects targeting mainly Asian buyers, South American buyers potentially, and relying on Europe as a secondary market rather than the kind of buyer that's going to make the anchor and allow for the project to be bankable. So price is one issue. The other one is the type of demand that you see in Northwest Europe. LNG projects that we discussed like to see longer term type take or pay agreements, ideally, into markets that are secure and very well established. Northwest Europe, again, is not a market that you can now have long-term contracts and live with the exposure you have from other hub pricing around you. So there's that issue there on being able to actually have those long-term contracts into Northwest Europe for US projects. So it's both a price issue and the type of contract you could sign on the long-term take or pay. But again, you have to look at Europe very differently from the Northwest Europe to Southern Europe, where the markets are not as developed and as liberalized. Yeah.
Great. Does anyone else want to add anything? Are you okay?
He's the expert on that.
Yep.
He's the guy who got me into Freeport LNG. So
Oh, excellent. Okay, great.
thank you, Majid.
Do we have some more questions? We still have some time. Yes, please. Thank you. The microphone is coming. Thank you.
Rudolph Hauser, retired. Two quick questions. The first, you haven't talked about the prospect for carbon taxes. What do you think those possibilities are, and what impact would that have on the energy markets? And the second question is, with regard to one of the studies that's been out there, that you've had negative free cash flow from petroleum fracking, even if you adjust for eliminating new capacity. I've been told most of these companies would either still have negative free cash flow or at least not be able to make a decent return on capital. Do you have any comments on that? And what is the situation in the gas industry, where fracking is not as much of a problem as in the petroleum in terms of the profitability?
Let me take the latter part of your question around fracking to begin with. So, it's interesting when producers say, I'm drilling a well and I'm generating a 50% IRR, they're talking about a half cycle return. And, generally that's true, but some of them may be cherry picking their best wells. Sometimes they may be downspacing and testing things, and the results aren't quite what they advertise. But I think by and large, there's a very compelling resource that works on a half cycle basis. The question is, once you start layering on G&A, once you start layering on the cost of the acreage up front, that's where the cost of capital has been very, very low. And historically, we used to live in a gas market that was, $8, $9, even $12, and the industry fundamentally changed that paradigm. So they bought very high cost acreage, prices went down quite a bit, so unless you were in on the ground floor, you weren't going to make a return. On the oil side, you have to ask yourself, you know, is the US market really going to continue to be more and more competitive, and is the resource deeper than most people are predicting? And if that has a material impact on the global oil price, you may see the same thing. But what I like to remind people about sunk costs is they're sunk, right? So what's the best way to maximize value today? And as an individual producer, you drill, right? And that's effectively what they're doing. The public investors are telling them, as a group, I don't want you to drill quite this much, even though individually it makes sense. But that's kind of like forming a mini OPEC cartel within a very fragmented industry, and I'm not sure how that's really gonna work in practice.
Yeah, I don't think we can give you an answer on your carbon tax question. That's going to be out there for a while for people to discuss the implicit cost of carbon.
Well, I think, you know, it's interesting because I think even in countries like Canada right now, depending on the province, there are questions as to what that carbon tax will look like, or if it will in fact stay in place. I know that that's been a big initiative on the part of the Trudeau government, right, to have it across all the provinces of Canada, but now it's sort of running into some sort of stumbling blocks. We saw in the state of Washington most recently in the election that Washington State struck down a carbon tax, a carbon fee. I think that's what they were sort of, the platform was around a fee as opposed to a tax. I find it really interesting. It's a question that I discuss in my classes in terms of, you know, from an economics point of view, it seems like it's the way to go, right? It is to just put a price on carbon. That said, I know the Wall Street Journal this week ran 2 editorials which were both very anti-carbon tax, and they looked at the protests in France as kind of an example of the public outrage to sort of paying an extra price for carbon, even though I think that was a little bit of a stretch in terms of doing that. But nonetheless, I think it's interesting to see sort of what it will look like. I mean, other countries have cap and trade systems, and you know, California and Quebec have a cap and trade sort of system in place. But I think when we say the word tax, and I'm looking at Gil here, is sort of more most people in the United States just say, no, we don't want a tax.
Well, I'm not sure why you looked at me, but yeah, I mean, you have the basic 2 problems: who's going to pay for it, and how are you going to prove the numbers right? And it's just a question of political will addressing it, because you're not going. Those other 2 points will fold when the political will is there.
Thank you. So we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. Thank you.
Hi, my name is William Lin. I work at Seabird Cisneros. So I heard today that the current administration of the U.S. is rolling back some of the subsidies for renewable energy. I was wondering your opinion on whether how that affects the future for renewable energy in the U.S. and whether like China's subsidies for for example, solar panels affects, I guess, everything from the output to the sustainability of solar panels.
I'm not entirely sure what that rollback really means, because to the extent that we've got federal incentives, those are legislated, and I don't know that there's a lot that can be changed to it. For instance, a lot of people have pointed out that to the extent you have subsidies on electric cars, in many cases those subsidies have run off because they only cover a certain amount of car production, and the car production's been met. To the extent you see a lot of the subsidies on renewable energy in terms of power generation, that's not coming from the federal government at all. That's coming from the states, the local public service and public utilities commissions, and from you and me paying our utility bills. So I'm not sure where that comes out apart from headlines at the moment. We'll just have to wait and see how it translates into actual legislative work at the federal and state and policy work at the state level.
Look, I think the industry's set up right now. They're assuming all the subsidies are going to go away, and they work without. The technology works in some places in the U.S. without a subsidy. Look at Texas. It's been working incredibly well for a long time, and it's taken market share away from gas, clearly. And in some places, as Gil mentioned, it's going to be driven by the states and by corporates, and I don't see that stopping. And I think the cost structure is going to continue to improve. And it's really the market that's going to be ultimately driving this change, I think, to a much greater degree than any kind of regulation.
Yeah, I'd point out, for instance, when we look at renewables in 2018 in terms of where we've seen a lot of the activity, the big thing that we've seen is private sector PPAs, the corporate office parks, the large corporations, et cetera, and that doesn't involve subsidies. That's part of American society at this point. So I share the view that I don't view this as a subsidy-driven industry anymore.
Any final questions before we wrap it up? There's a reception downstairs. First of all, I want to thank all of you for being here, and sincere thanks to our panelists for their
Well, thank you for
excellent
guiding
comments.
us.